Will democracy survive the next couple of years?
Essentially, we are the same.
There are so many needs that Minnesota has.
What people are saying they need right now.
Access to Democracy is made possible in part by a donation from Firefly Credit Union. Firefly is the new name of U.S. federal credit union, which has proudly served the financial needs of the greater Twin Cities community since 1925. At Firefly, we guide our members forward and give them the power to chase dreams by delivering the financial solutions they need to get ahead. From checking accounts to mortgages, we'll light the way. We are Firefly Credit Union, and this is life illuminated. By Thomson Reuters, providing legal professionals with intelligence, technology, and human expertise they need to find trusted answers. Thomson Reuters, the answer company. Online at thomsonreuters.com. And Dr. Charles Crutchfield of award-winning Crutchfield Dermatology in Eagan. Acknowledged as one of the nation's best physicians, a Minnesota native who trained at the Mayo Clinic, Dr. Crutchfield personally treats all patients and states that experience counts and quality matters. Crutchfield Dermatology, look good, feel great, with beautiful skin.
Welcome to this edition of Access to Democracy. My name is Paul Anderson, former Minnesota Supreme Court Justice Paul Anderson. My privilege to be the host today, but even more of a privilege, we have as our guest former Minnesota Secretary of State March Ritchie. Welcome.
Thank you, Justice Anderson.
So, I'm going to start out with a question. Right? Okay, former Secretary of State, what are you doing now?
I'm the president of Global Minnesota, which is a 70-year-old organization that has been dedicated from the beginning to connecting Minnesotans to the world and the world to Minnesota.
Okay. Now, I'm going to want to focus on what you're doing now, but I want to have two focuses to this interview. One is about democracy under siege. It's about the right to vote, the integrity of our election process. You are probably one of the most knowledgeable people in the country on this issue. And second, I want to focus a bit on Global Minnesota. But let's start focusing on Secretary of State. What does the Secretary of State do?
Thank you for that question. The Secretary of State is seen in the public primarily as the Chief Elections Officer, kind of the back office for the local election officials who really run our democracy. The Secretary of State's office does everything from maintaining the registered voter list to being the producer of many of the materials and, at the end of the day, part of the state canvassing board that certifies the final results. But that's about 25%
really?
Of the work of the office.
I thought it was almost all.
I know. 75% is providing the place where Minnesotans, whether they're forming a new business, a new nonprofit, looking to find a notary public or doing an overseas adoption, the Office of Secretary of State is the place where the Minnesota government provides services to our businesses and citizens that allow them to do the everyday activities of life. There's some smaller things that we do, but those two big things, business services and registration and other services for our companies and nonprofits, and being the state's chief election officer in the back office for the voting process that we're really proud of here in Minnesota.
So you have a lot to do with making government work well for the people then, don't you?
Yes, and I believe that I had the privilege of inheriting an incredible team of employees who are really dedicated. Every day they are helping thousands. Let's just take starting new businesses. We have over 60,000 new businesses started in Minnesota every year, and they register at the Office of Secretary of State. People want to be able to do that online, quickly. They want to be able to access that information, and they want those services to be kept up to date with the newest technology and the newest available innovations. And Minnesota is very blessed. I had the privilege of being the president of the National Associations of Secretaries of State, and often I would be asked, how did you get such a great online system or Tell me about that new approach to handling corporate filings or amendments, things that outside of the Office of Secretary of State people don't think about, but other secretaries of state would look at Minnesota's system and say, hey, that's great. And we began to take the information about the number of filings and where are those filings, and to begin compile that with other economic data so we could begin predicting and talking about the state of Minnesota's economy, because we could put our finger on the single most important birthplace of our future economy is the creation of new businesses, some of them someday which will grow.
So thank you for that, because having worked with good things don't just happen naturally. You have to pay attention. But I want to focus on that 25%, the elections and the integrity of election. Are you still involved in any oversight or work on elections?
Well, I'm in the National Advisory Board of the Federal Election Assistance Commission. That's the EAC. It was created after that big debacle in Florida. Right. Sometimes people remember that.
Well, that's what brought you Secretary of State into the focus, isn't it?
Exactly. And the EAC, as it's called, I'm one of the appointed people on that advisory board by the U.S. Senate, the Rules Committee, which has the oversight. And so I'm getting a steady flow of information about everything from cybersecurity to the outside attacks from other countries, information about attempts to sort of restrict or prevent people from voting, to what's the newest thinking about different kinds of technology, because there's all kinds of discussions underway about the innovation part of election. So in that way, I'm also trying to be as conscious as I can be about the new challenges. When I was Secretary of State, 2007 to 2015, there were sort of an awareness that certain things like putting computers as the voting mechanism made them vulnerable to hacking and was a very expensive and not a very dependable system. But I say we had not the opportunity to imagine some of the things that we've seen now. For example,
I'm going to ask you.
Yes,
this is a bit of an unfair. What is the state of the integrity of elections in the United States right now?
Okay, I'll give you my personal opinion. One is that we have made ourselves vulnerable in the sense of our equipment and technology, but we know how to solve that. For example, a precinct in a state that will remain unnamed was vulnerable because it used a kind of electronic computer to be the list of voters. When you come into a polling place, you have to get your name and checked off. And they made that system vulnerable to being hacked and shut down, so they couldn't check in voters. That meant that they had to call downtown, and voters backed up. But when you get a long line running out the door, and you have busy lives and students and people with jobs, you essentially suppress the vote. So that
it's actually promoting self-disenfranchisement, isn't it?
Yeah, and you feel bad, and then once you start feeling bad about voting, maybe the next time you say, well, I'm just not even going to bother. Or somebody says, all those people didn't get to vote. It's a rigged system. And young people in particular have said this to me more times than I care to know. But that's one part of this question you asked me. We have technology vulnerabilities of all kinds, but I believe we know how to fix those, and I believe that Minnesota has that kind of integrity in the system of the voting. However, there's a new threat to voting, which is the one that we sometimes call...
Before I leave
Yes?
that, I have a question. Do we need written ballots as a backup? Can we trust computers?
No. I think this is really this is a very simple answer for me. Absolutely not. People have to write on their ballot, make the circle or whatever it is, and that's their vote. Because if you have a recount and the emotions are high and everybody is looking, you have to have the ballot to be able to say out loud who actually won. I had that experience in Minnesota with 3 statewide recounts and many others. So having a paper ballot is not only the least expensive and the most effective in terms of overseas voters and that. It's the only way to show to the public how the outcome of an election actually turned out. And having paper ballots, there was a time period where some states moved to electronic computer voting. It was the modern way to do things. They learned their lessons the hard way. And now you can see a movement back towards what we call the Minnesota system. Paper ballots where you fill in optical scans equipment that does the fast count, physical recounts when it's close. This Minnesota system has become the kind of gold standard, and you can see states returning to that system.
It's also accountability. It's a disincentive for people who want to commit fraud if they know that there's a backup ballot.
Well, and this was very important to me in my learning, like blocking voting by putting a chain around the door. Some precincts in our civil rights struggle, okay, that's one way to block voting. Using the computer to overwhelm and shut down a system of checking in voters is another way to close down a polling place. So this modern technology, our minds have to be very agile and say, oh, they've thought of a new trick, let's get ahead of it. But the thing that was the most difficult for me to understand and then to see the implications is the way that social media has been harnessed to create false impressions, false information, physical threats and potential, and in some cases violence.
Now we're transitioning what you wanted to talk about.
Because
these are the modern threats that we weren't aware of in the past.
And in some ways, this is the part that's become the most, I would say, potentially alarming in terms of democracy as a concept. And let me just, for full disclosure, I spent some part of last year studying deeply ancient democracy in Greece. They had voting machines at 500 BC, trying to make sure elections were fair. Yes, and so I realized that protecting the idea of democracy and advancing the idea of democracy is something that Minnesotans really take seriously, and I, as Secretary of State, took that really seriously. And getting the equipment right and making sure we had our rules right, all of that. But then I've realized that this attack through the social media is probably the thing that could really damage the idea of democracy. If you have phony voting machines or computerized voting, that's damaging, but you can get rid of those. When you erode people's trust in the system and in each other, when you create a falsehood and then apply that and manipulate the outcome, that's new.
I want to follow up on this, as I've done on other occasions. I mean, in voting, there's ignorance and negligence, and that's what you try to eliminate as Secretary of State.
You do your best. You try to educate, and you try to make sure that the people working the system, we have 30,000 people who volunteer as elected, they need to know best practices and the rules.
And there is ignorance and negligence that will cause mistakes. On the other end of the spectrum is malfeasance and fraud. And there's not a whole lot of fraud in the current election system, is there?
Well, every once in a while you'll have a situation like we saw in North Carolina where somebody was running an absentee vote, fraud machine. It was amazing to have something that sophisticated become public. But generally speaking, we don't have that. We have mistakes that are made and that kind of thing. But when we look hard at the attempts to misinform voters, when we look hard at the attempts to actually deny people the right to vote, we move into a category of vote suppression.
That's the category. The word you used was manipulation.
Yeah. Here's for instance. Minnesota has a fairly unique law that makes it illegal to promote false information about voting. One year in my car, there was a flyer that said, "Remember, don't forget to vote. Republicans vote on Tuesday, Democrats vote on Wednesday." It was a flyer. And so that is false information. Now, under a Minnesota law that was passed I think a decade or two ago, that information would have to be corrected, and the person who perpetrated that false information, if they could be identified, would have to take steps to correct that information.
Were they guilty of an offense?
Well, so this was before we had the law.
Okay.
So in fact, passing out false information was not per se against the law. But the point for me that has really made me know I have to open my mind and study more carefully is that if social media can be overtaken and then turned into something that destroys people's expectation, their belief, their trust in the democracy, then the things that we have come to cherish, for example, defending the nation when the nation's threatened, advocating for the rights of the Bill of Rights, but also the rights of the minority point of view, the freedom of the press, the freedom of religion, all of those things that requires you to have a faith in and a belief in your citizens and your fellow Americans could in fact make our nation much more coarse, much less civil, much less prosperous, because we have been successful because we work together to build the schools, to educate ourselves and our children, to build the highways and the railroads, to put our economy. These are the things that democracy has given us. We might lose them.
Now, I want to get to your new role with Global Minnesota, but I want to end up on manipulation. I mean, you have kind of like new Jim Crow laws, the voter ID, restricting access to polls, requiring a driver's license in Alabama, and then shutting down driver's license plates. Gerrymandering. That's a manipulation.
Gerrymandering, big one, yeah. Attempting to manipulate the census.
Oh.
We're finding out now that there's an attempt to make the census a way of pushing people out as a way to then make people just really unwilling to be in the census, then allowing that to be used to be an internal sort of blind or ghost gerrymandering.
It's interesting you bring that up, because the parties have found us what I would refer to in the legal parlance a smoking gun, where in fact, are you familiar with
Well,
what?
I saw the headline this morning that they actually found a hard drive of an operative who had died, and it was somehow the hard drive was there, and that hard drive included very specific information about manipulating the census for the purpose of partisan advantage. This is a little shocking. I guess it shouldn't be shocking, but in my naive Minnesota sort of way, this is wrong, and as a nation, it's not who we are. And if in fact we put party allegiance before the nation, we're in trouble.
Okay, I want to transition global. But so, what can the average citizen do to prepare him or herself and to? I mean, it's defending. I mean, it's democracy under siege.
Yeah.
How do we defend this?
3 things. Run for political office. All of the incredible people watching this program and watching other things, these are the good people who at some point in life should consider that being in elected political office, they could serve the public in that good. Now, that's very few people, but I want to make that as a point. I had never been involved in electoral politics before, but I was worried about the elections and I ran. Second thing is, be an election judge. We have 30,000. We must have 30,000 election judges for every vote, and you can make a difference. We have a system of half Republican, half Democrat as our election judge. So we have 4 eyes from competing political parties on each step of the way of the election. This is incredibly important for protecting the integrity. But for an individual, you have to get your information from a lot of different sources. You have to be
That's number 3.
properly skeptical about almost anything, but not dismissive, not what's the word we use, sort of you become just kind of like above the fray, well, it's all phony or it's all fake. No, you have to say that doesn't ring true or that is alarming, and then you have to look further and dig deeper. At the end of the day, our elected officials and the appointed officials that they choose are a place where we can go and say, I have a real question about this, Mr. Congressperson or Ms. Senator. We can make the system more transparent by being actively involved.
So you're echoing Thomas Jefferson. He said, if you have any question about the people exercising the vote properly, the answer is not taking the vote away from them, but to educate them.
Exactly.
Now,
exactly.
that's
Yes.
educating. Let's
Yeah.
get to Global Minnesota.
What is
it about?
Well, it's about educating people. In
About
fact,
what?
Here's the mission: advancing international understanding and engagement. But let me go back. 70-some years ago, right after the Second World War, students were coming over from other countries, some faculty. People at the University of Minnesota said, we need a center, an international center for foreign students, so they have a touch place, so they can feel welcome. In fact,
that used to be your name, the International
yes,
Center.
that's right. And the early brochures, they're like, here's the title, they've come as strangers. We hope they go home as a friend. In the third year of that, there was an awareness that it wasn't just at the University of Minnesota, it was at every school. And it wasn't just on campuses, it was the whole society. And so they transitioned to create a standalone organization, Minnesota International Center. And one of my favorite old brochures, I found one that says, if you're a member of Minnesota International Center, you have friends in every country.
So you're dealing with exchanges?
Well, so the Minnesota International Center grew to become Global Minnesota. And in that growth, one of the most important things is that we're the official greet and organizing place for the 450 or so official visitors that come to Minnesota from the State Department, sent by our embassies around the planet. Small groups of people, 5, 6, 7.
So this is
interested in a
global.
subject.
It's global
This is
what you
global.
do. Yeah.
And so those individuals coming, maybe they're judges from a country that want to see our system. Maybe they're firefighters who want to compare notes about these really disastrous fires. Sometimes they're women entrepreneurs. There have been a lot of women entrepreneur visitor group. Last month, Minnesota International Center, which is now Global Minnesota, was asked to provide the national conference for the Fulbright Scholars.
Ooh.
So our nation hosts many Fulbright Scholars. They get the opportunity to go and meet other Fulbrights in another city and to learn about that city and then to focus on a particular topic. In this case, it was food security, economic security, kind of perfect for Minnesota. And those, I was there for the opening and the closing and a little bit in the middle, but at the closing, they evaluated it and they gave us 3 really important messages. One, when they went out and had dinners with Minnesotans, that was the high point, meeting Minnesotans. The second was, it was a chance to see, some of them even said, they were coming to Minnesota, they thought it was kind of farm country, they expected us to be kind of a rural town of some kind. They were sort of surprised to see a big city, and they were also surprised to see how cosmopolitan and how international we were. So that was nice. But the final thing was, one of the gentlemen from India spoke about how we're raised and we grow up and we're socialized to think of some people as our friends and some people as our enemies. And when he came there, he realized that he was interacting with people who were defined in his society from Pakistan as the enemy, and he realized that was really a false stereotype, a false notion, and that gave him a new understanding of what were the things needed to advance peace and cooperation.
So if I'm an ordinary citizen out there, or I'm a business leader, or I'm a corporate leader, I mean, why should, I'd ask the question, why should I be concerned about Global Minnesota? What do you do for us that benefits us?
That's right. So we advance international understanding. So you asked the question about how do we deal with, let's say, ignorance. It's a strong word. People often don't know how we're connected to the world markets, how dependent our universities and colleges are on students, how important it has been that our young people have gone overseas and been hosted at a home in high school or in college. So people are often amazed when they hear the statistics or the stories or the ways that being international. But on the other hand, once somebody is aware, they also are aware that their decisions being made sometimes bad for Minnesota. We've had a difficult time with the denial of visas for students coming to go to college in Minnesota. This hurts our colleges, and so people want to say, well, How do we change that situation? What can we do? Or here's a more positive example. I'm working with a public-private partnership, a citizens committee, to bring a World's Fair on health and wellness and medicine to Minnesota. We've got a fantastic
Clinic, right?
all of them, Mayo and Medtronic, and all of the people who work on mental health and all the other issues. And what's important is that we have a fantastic bid, a fantastic place, a great idea, and we need the support from 169 countries. They need to know Minnesota. They need to know that we're the world global center on medicine, and they need to want to come here and be part of a World's Fair process. And so when Minnesotans get engaged, people say, oh, Minnesota, I've heard of Minnesota, that's the Mayo Clinic, or I've heard of Minnesota, that's the University of Minnesota, or maybe they've only heard it a little bit, and we can get them to come visit, and once they've come, then they become friends of Minnesota's forever.
I'm going to ask you a fairly loaded question.
Okay.
Is your job as Global Minnesota made more difficult with the current attitudes expressed in the State Department?
Well, you might find this surprising, but my experience is that the current climate has raised the public's interest in what is going on. Yes. So they go through the newspaper in the morning, they go, wait a minute, what is that? And so then when we offer a lot of public programs that are free, topics, and so people start turning out and saying, I've been worried about that and I didn't know, what to do. So one of the, I would say, ironies of the current situation is that global issues often just get left off the table, particularly in presidential elections or something. Now they've come up. And I believe in our assessment of the situation that Global Minnesota's 70 years of experience makes us well prepared to take that interest and turn it into real engagement.
So you got increased interest, but how do you survive? Where does your support come from?
We're very fortunate because over the 70 years, we've had very strong support from the Minnesota business community.
So they make contributions?
Or regular members. Very strong support from the individuals, the families and individuals who come and participate in the programs. We also do a gala coming up very soon.
That's when you're focusing on South Africa. That's coming up in June, right?
In June, and every year we have a different countries of focus. Last year, China. This year, South Africa. Next year, Italy. And because we do these important services for some parts of, administration, that kind of stuff, sometimes people are engaging with us because they want the kind of international perspective that we have. We've been very successful. We have a small team that's super dedicated. But how I judge our success is that at the national level, when they think of where to bring the Fulbrights,
it's Minnesota?
It's Minnesota.
Okay, we got about 15 seconds. I mean, you were in the public eye as Secretary of State. Is your current position interesting and challenging?
It is incredibly exciting. It uses all of the pieces of my life put together, and it's the opportunity to work with young people in particular in a dynamic team. And for me, that way of thinking about the future makes every day very exciting.
So we have to end. We wish you well in your efforts with Global Minnesota.